Everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Skeleton Crew. I'm your host, Jen Callahan, and tonight I have with me a great guest. His name is John Stewart. He is the CEO and founder of Scriptor software, and he also too has an impressive background of being a radiologist as well as being a former NASA engineer. So I'm very excited to have this conversation with you tonight, John. Thank you for being with me.
Oh, yeah, thanks. Hopefully, we have a great conversation.
Yeah, for sure. So let's start with the past and kind of touch on the fact that, that you worked for NASA, which is like super cool just on so many
Mhm.
different levels. What exactly was your role there?
Yeah, so I basically started working there when I was working on my master's degree. We had a program where NASA just happened to be very close to where the university was located. So if you wanted to do research at NASA for your master's or PhD, it was available to you. The professors at the university where I was doing my engineering degree said, "Hey, you should really consider doing this. It's a great experience." And so I decided I would do that. And they were right. It was a great experience. I was very lucky to be able to work there.
So while you were there, is anything noteworthy that you had a hand in or helped develop or possibly evolve while you were there at your time at NASA?
There's amazing projects that come through NASA, and it's just, it's one unbelievable project after another. We were in a group that was called the Geo Lab, or Geometry Laboratory, and our job was to put together 3D models of aircraft and spacecraft so they could be tested on the computer. And so we had all these really cool aircraft and spacecraft coming through. And for my master's research, I was able to work on a Mars entry vehicle for a manned mission to Mars at that time. So that was really neat. And as time went on, we were finding that we needed certain software things to be written that just didn't exist.
Okay.
So we just started writing those software packages ourselves. And that's kind of where I really learned to program well, is at NASA.
Your time there was in the early 90s, which is kind of, I mean, obviously computers had been around for an extended period of time before the 90s, but I feel like the computers at that time, at least to my knowledge, or feel like that I remember, were not to say rudimentary, but not obviously of what we have today. So for you to have had a hand in developing software like that, that's pretty monumental, I feel like.
Yeah, we were using Silicon Graphics computers mainly for the 3D modeling and software that we wrote. And so we did have to learn how to use the graphics packages that were available in there. And then we would run our time, and I think people have probably heard of now, which are called Cray computers. And that was really neat because very shortly after I got there, they got their first Cray C computer, and they like put it in this special room, and they put a window on the side of the room so you could look at it, and they had special lighting on it, and like fluid was running through the computer to cool it while it was running. And it was just such a crazy thing to have fluid running through a computer. They always had the best equipment, and it was just a really neat place to work.
So going from NASA to then becoming a radiologist, what made you do that type of transition? I feel like biomed engineering has a hand in looking in radiology and healthcare, but what made you want to do a transition like that?
Well, it kind of evolved, of course, that's several years' time. Like the MD PhD program was 7 years alone before I decided to do radiology. So obviously at NASA, I was doing a lot of 3D software development where we were doing 3D modeling and so forth. So I kind of just dovetailed that into what I was doing next for my research at Medical College of Virginia. And that was creating 3D computer models of anatomy. So I would start with a CT scan or MRI, and I would basically convert those to 3D models. And then it kind of kept going from there. I said, well, if I can create a 3D model, I can actually analyze that model, look at curvature and look at, what shapes don't belong in an artery. Well, spherical shapes don't belong in an artery. It should be all cylinders. So you would basically try to find these spherical shapes. And that was kind of became my project for my PhD, was finding aneurysms in MRA images. And so that's kind of how it evolved. And then, obviously I'm very involved in radiology and 3D modeling and computer type things. So radiology was an obvious, natural thing to go into at that point.
Is there a specific modality that you prefer out of all of them to read, or one that you actually possibly specialized in for reading?
No, most radiologists read all modalities. It's more of a specialty to the body area that you're going to work in. And so I was a general radiologist over the years. my specialties really become ER radiology work, reading ER cases. So I read neuro and I read, all different types of specialties, but in the ER focus. So for instance, if a patient's having a stroke, I'm going to read those cases because those are ER cases.
Right.
So it could be an MRI stroke case or a CT perfusion study. But if it's a brain tumor and very complicated and stuff, the neuroradiologists are going to read that, not me. But those are not typically the cases that are coming into the ER. Those are inpatients and so forth. So it kind of goes more by specialty than by modality.
This software that we're going to be talking about, the Scriptor software, I'm sure it came out of development of you working as a radiologist. And I'm going to assume that frustrations that you had of your own with possibly making reports. So let's kind of delve into the software that you developed and the company that you founded. Maybe just share the background of the company and what your MO is for it.
Yeah. So as you point out, the idea came about just through me working with generating reports and finding out how frustrating it was. When I was kind of coming through the very start of my career and also during residency, we weren't using voice recognition. It was too early still. So
Right.
that was just coming out as I was starting my career in private practice initially. And what was amazing to me is that, usually when you add a computer or software into a workflow, that workflow becomes more efficient. And the hospitals were introducing voice recognition into our radiologist workflow and getting rid of the transcriptionists. And by introducing a computer into the workflow, our productivity took a nosedive. Like we could not work as fast as we used to because we were editing the reports. The dictation software was not nearly as good as it is now. And so you took a real hit with that. And my idea was that this is not right. There should be software that makes you more productive, not less productive.
Sure.
And so I was just kind of throwing out, how can I do that? How can I make that work? At the time, I was just thinking about for myself. I wasn't trying to develop software or start a company. I was just trying to be more efficient for me. And so I had this idea that I should be able to dictate anything I want and have that text go into the report in the right place. I figured out, okay, how can I do that? Coming through the ideas of how I can make that happen and just started writing the code. When I was in private practice, I wasn't writing the code at that time because there was no motivation at that time because in private practice, everybody makes the same amount. There's no real impetus to work and read 10 times more than your fellow colleague. But
Right.
when I started teleradiology after 7 years of private practice, then there certainly was a reason. We got paid per case. And if I could read cases at a very high quality level, but quickly, then I could make more money. And so the goal was I wanted my reports to look as good or better than anybody else's reports. And so that was definitely the first goal or the first task. The reports have to be extremely high quality. And then how can I do that more efficiently? And that's kind of how what evolved. Eventually, that became a program that I was using. And then people noticed that I was using it, generating like large numbers of reports, not making mistakes. Reports were great quality. People were complimenting them. The referring physicians liked them. Then they took notice and I said, well, I'm doing it with some software I wrote. And then they wanted to license the software. And that's how the company started. So the company kind of started organically. It wasn't like anything that was planned. It was just evolved into that, into a company.
Like you weren't instinctively going out to try to make this, and it kind of just, like you said, it happened
Mhm.
organically. It's funny that people are noticing, wow, he's reading really fast and everything is right and there's no errors. And
The first person who saw it was actually a tech who was trying to help me with something on my computer that wasn't right. And then I was showing him, and I created a couple reports while I was waiting for him to finish what he was doing. He's going, what exactly are you doing? How are you doing that?" And that's how the word got out at that point. The cat was out of the bag and he saw it. And then he talked to the administrators about, you should really look at this. It seems like he's able to be more efficient. And they agreed and they licensed it eventually.
so the software that you developed, is it basically like you're looking at the images, you're dictating into the dictation device? Are you just saying what you're saying and then it then is pulling the information from what you're saying and putting it into the proper spots?
Yeah, exactly. So the idea was trying to solve another problem, so there's an efficiency problem that the software addresses, but there's also a big problem with fatigue that's generated. If you want to dictate structure reports, You experience a lot of fatigue because you're continually having to look at the images and then looking at the dictation and back and forth, just on one case. And if you're doing that for, 8, 10, 12-hour shift, it is extremely exhausting to do that all day long. And so the other idea with the software is to solve that. I want to dictate just random order, anything I want, and just let the software take care of putting it into the right place in the report so that I can focus on the images and never have to look at the dictation. So when I'm dictating, I'm never looking at the dictation window until I'm ready to sign the report. When I'm done dictating, I look over at the dictation window. I hit create report. It creates a report in about 1 second, and I look at it, make sure everything looks right, and sign it. I don't have to dictate anything more. My findings, my impression, recommendations, they're all written on in one step for me all together. So what we do that's a little bit different also is that we provide all of the input, the report templates, what we call smart macros, so a whole set of macros that you can use,
Mhm.
and a huge knowledge base of about 1,300 pages. So all of the stuff that you need to be a radiologist is in the software. So a lot of, dictation software, when you get it, they say, yeah, we support structured reports, but you got to create all the templates. Good luck, go create all those templates. We don't do that. We give you 360 templates right from the day one. You start out with those, and then you can modify them. Or if you say our group already uses structured report templates that look like this, we basically pull your templates into our software so that you can use all the functionality of rScriptor and produce the exact same looking reports as you currently have. All of that is basically, trying to accommodate whatever a practice needs.
You're currently reading Telerad, you're doing reading for?
Yeah, I'm a teleradiologist and I read for a practice that's in California. Basically work early mornings, which is late nights in California. And I do that week on, week off. I've done that for the last 11 years, for really the whole time, almost the entire time that rScriptor has been in existence. And that has been extremely helpful because what I do typically is I come up with ideas while I'm reading cases and what's the next piece that I need as a radiologist to make me more efficient and to make it easier to generate these reports. So I come up with those ideas. Then the next week, when I have a week off, because I work week on, week off,
Okay.
I'll write that and then I'll test it and then we'll release it. We do releases of probably 10 or more releases a year. And it's basically incremental improvements every year with new capabilities that we build into the software. And it's done based upon that system where I come up with an idea, the next week I write it, the next week I test it, and then we release it. And it just goes like that.
This episode is brought to you by xraytech.org, the RadTech career resource. If you're considering a career in radiology, check out xraytech.org to get honest information on schools, degree options, career paths, and salaries.
How do the other radiologists that you work with, this Telerad company, I'm assuming they use the rScriptor as well, and do they feel happy with the progression of their work and how quickly that they're able to move through their work?
The entire practice doesn't use rScriptor, and that's pretty common amongst practices where the way we do things, and certainly I acknowledge this from the very start, is that some radiologists are very set in the way they want to do things, and they're probably going to continue to do them that way for the rest of their career. We provide them with a tool that can make them about 20% faster, but they may say, I don't care about being faster. I'm happy with what I'm doing right now.
Yeah.
And that's fine. So we only charge, for radiologists in the practice who are using the software. At the practice I'm currently at, a group who uses it and a group who doesn't. Generally, the reason is almost the group that doesn't, and I've seen this at the practice I'm at now, it's mostly radiologists who want to do narrative reporting. So they're used to dictating paragraphs instead of structure reporting where you're dictating just individual findings. They're so used to that, they don't want to change to structure reporting, which is really when you do structure reporting, that's the piece, if you do it the right way, the way that we developed in rScriptor, that allows you to be much more efficient. But it requires you to transition to structure reporting from narrative. And you just have a lot of radiologists who don't want to make that transition. They want to stay there doing narrative reporting. And narrative reporting is simply slower. You can't achieve the same level of efficiency with narrative reporting that you can with structure reporting. And the reason is very simple, is because with structure reporting, you don't have to dictate the negative findings. So I'm only dictating what's wrong with the patient. I skip everything that's normal. With narrative reporting, you have to dictate all of that, all the negative, all the positive, a lot more words, so a lot slower. With structure reporting, a lot fewer words, and so it's faster.
When you're saying like positive findings, negative findings, something as heart size is normal, something like that would not be put into it, because that would be considered a negative finding. Am I right?
Correct. Now that's going to be in the report, but I don't have to dictate it because rScriptor or even any structure reporting system, it's already going to be in the report so you start out basically with a normal report, has all the pertinent negative findings, including the heart size is normal.
Okay. Or like lungs
And
are clear or something like
right. And if I don't say anything about the heart, it leaves that. Now, if I say cardiomegaly, that's the whole idea of rScriptor. I say cardiomegaly, I just keep dictating. There's no template to look at while I'm dictating. I'm just dictating findings that are abnormal, just abnormalities. And then I push a button and it puts all those abnormalities into the report where they belong and removes any negative statement that would conflict with what I just said.
Mhm.
So basically, it's doing all that process for me very efficiently.
Does the software have anything kind of like, I guess it would be like a red flag at the end, like, or like a hard stop, like before you would sign off on the report, this is something like maybe you're supposed to measure the size of something.
Yeah, so there's a whole series of warning systems built into rScriptor. So, and a lot of software has this kind of warning system. Basically, if I say hysterectomy and it's a male patient, that wouldn't make sense. So
Right.
the software will pop up a warning. So once you create the report, the software is analyzing it and saying, is there anything that's not right in this report? If it sees something that's not right, it warns you with a little pop-up window.
Okay.
And the radiologist has the opportunity because when they create the report, they haven't signed it yet. They're just looking at the final report, but it's not signed. So they have the ability to go back and fix it before they sign it. We do that for errors, like we talked about. We can find anatomy errors, like if you say metatarsal and it's a hand x-ray, that's a foot bone, that's not a hand bone. So it'll warn you about that. It'll warn you if you have MIPS requirements, like for instance, if you say there's renal cyst and you don't say no follow-up is necessary, you'll get warnings for that. And then we have even built in if a radiology practice wants custom warnings. So they want for even a particular referring physician or for a particular practice, they want certain things said in the report. We could build those warnings. We build those warnings all the time for practices that say, we got to have this set in the report. So make sure you put that somewhere in the report. We'll pop up those warnings as well.
What would be an example of certain requirements that practices would have?
The most specific one and kind of strange one I've ever had to do, the practice said, if you're reading a chest x-ray on a pediatric patient, you must mention the trachea. Now that's for croup and certain disease states that affect the trachea in kids. So what we did is they only wanted it for one of the practices. So it was a pediatric practice. They didn't have to do it for anybody else. We put in a rule that said if it's this practice, if it's a pediatric patient and it's a chest x-ray, check the report to see if they mentioned the trachea. If they didn't mention the trachea, pop up a message saying, hey, you have to say something about the trachea for this particular practice. So that's kind of one of the very specific rules that we created one time. One of the things that we've kind of adopted, and it's kind of evolved over time, is the concept of adaptive structure reporting. So rScriptor doesn't have fixed templates. So you think that most people think about a template, it's a pre-written report that you have to insert text into. The reality is in rScriptor, the templates are not fixed. So what that means is that if it's a contrast enhanced CT, the template's actually different than for a non-contrast CT. So it adapts to the particular situation. For a pediatric x-ray, the wording in the report is different. And even the sections of the report are different than for an adult x-ray. And then even things like when you're reading a chest CT, sometimes you see a gallbladder that's all inflamed. Well, gallbladder is not part of the chest, obviously. So normally you're not going to have a section in there for gallbladder, but rScriptor adapts to what you say. If you talk about an inflamed gallbladder, it automatically inserts a gallbladder section into the report. So it's doing all this adaptation. And then kind of the most advanced thing, we have macros. So people think about macros. If I say, normal appendix, it replaces it with a sentence, that might say, the appendix is normal and normal diameter with no inflammation, yada, yada, stuff. That's kind of the way that people are used to macros. Our macros are actually much more advanced than that. If I talk about an ovarian cyst in a woman, and I say the macro might be left ovarian cyst 3.5, The macro, when I create that report, the software actually looks at the age of the patient and says, okay, is that okay in this patient? What's the follow-up recommendation for a cyst of this size? If it's an 80-year-old, it's very different than if it's a 25-year-old. So again, the software is continually adapting itself to the demographics of the patient, to the exam type, to the age of the patient. All of those things are getting adapted while you're reading. So there's a lot of complexity and a lot of advanced software built into the background. Again, the goal is to produce the highest quality reports that we can produce that are the most accurate and give the most information. So adaptive structure reporting is kind of that concept that we built.
So you were saying about the certain criteria for like follow-ups. Now, I was reading on the website that you have the ACR, which is the American College of Radiology, that you pull from that to be able to enhance the software with things that you had just said with what a follow-up should be, so on and so forth. Now, I'm assuming that suggestions like that are updated, at least yearly from the ACR. So same thing with the way that you're updating the software. I'm assuming that you're pulling information from the ACR, from other accreditations to update that.
Yeah, exactly. So as that information, the ACR doesn't do yearly updates. That would be nice, but they don't quite do them that often. But when they do updates, or they sometimes release new recommendations for a different body part or a different disease state, we update those automatically so that the radiologist can use those. And for me, personally, what's even more important, because I use the smart macros, what we call smart macros, that thing where you can just dictate a few words and it puts in the finding and impression, was it actually puts in the recommendation as well. So all those ACR follow-up recommendations are built into the macros. When I say, again, right ovarian cyst 3.5, it automatically puts in the finding, the description of a more complete description. It puts in an impression if that's appropriate. And a 85-year-old, it's appropriate. And a 25-year-old, you don't need to even mention that in the impression. But it also puts in a recommendation for 85-year-old is going to be a recommendation for follow-up. And that's following the ACR guidelines. So I used to know the guidelines, probably had them more memorized than I do now. Now the software takes care of it for me. Can't even remember half what the recommendations are. I kind of have a general idea of what they are, but the very specific numbers, the thresholds and all that, it's all built into the software. So I don't hardly have to know what they are anymore.
So looking at your software, where it currently is now, and referring back to when you first started developing it, has there been huge advancements? You said basically you do at least 10 updates a year. I feel like it must look like a completely different software almost.
Yeah, the biggest changes over the years were, initially we got NLP, the natural language processing, working well. That took several years to get it really it's very, very accurate now. Well, I can say almost anything and it's going to do what I want it to do, put the text in the right place. The next thing that came was the knowledge base, and the knowledge base was a huge hit. That's very popular because as a radiologist, you're looking up, you can't remember all these flow charts and all these different things. With rScriptor, you basically pop up the knowledge base for almost any of these findings, and you just answer a series of questions, and it gives you the recommendation for that situation. And you just push a button, it pastes it into the report. So I don't even have to dictate the recommendation. It pastes it into the report for me. That was kind of the next big step. And then the third one was putting the knowledge base together with NLP engine. We made what are called the smart macros, where a set of text be specifically tied to a sentence or two sentences. We have a set of a text where you can insert numbers, you can insert, mild, moderate, severe, all these things, and it will automatically put that appropriate statement into the report. And probably the most recent thing that we did is we actually have now assigned an acuity level, meaning a negative finding, an incidental finding, an abnormal, acute, or a critical finding. Anything you dictate, rScriptor is going to assign an acuity level to that. And it's going to store that in its memory. When it creates a report, it's going to reorder your impression so that the most acute things are at the top and it goes down from there. I never want to have to look at my dictation window while I'm dictating. So I can dictate any finding I want, and it's going to take and basically insert, it's going to reorder my impression to automatically put the important things at the top, less important things at the bottom.
I kind of wanted to touch back on when we were discussing about narrative reporting and structured reporting and the way that some radiologists, like you said, prefer to do narrative reporting and some prefer to do the structured way. Do you see that there's a split between it? Is it kind of almost like maybe the way that education has changed with the way that radiologists are kind of taught on how to report? Like maybe there was a change in training almost, possibly like radiologists say from like 90 back kind of learned to report this way, and radiologists that went to medical school from the 90s forward, there's been a shift in that, or is it almost kind of just like a personal preference?
Yeah, I think that in general, radiologists are going to dictate the way that they were taught in residency. I mean, most of us are dictating very similar to that style, or at least if you were at a residency where they dictated 5 pages of text for every report, you're probably dictating a lot of text. I went to residency where we dictated very little, and so I'm still a very brief report dictator. That's kind of true that certainly you're going to follow the path that you were taught. But the interesting thing that we found is the first practice that adopted rScriptor was a very large teleradiology practice. And the administration there said, within 6 months, said, we want everybody using this. You can't pick and choose who's going to use it. And so that's different than most practices. You're in a private practice, everybody kind of has a say. But at a teleradiology practice, they can more easily say, we want you to do it this way. So they did it that way. And of course, we converted over half the radiologists were probably 75% were dictating narrative reports. We easily converted those all over to structured reporting. But it is a learning curve. And the learning curve is to just learn that you can't say the liver and spleen and kidneys are all normal. Well, those are 3 different structures. In structured reporting, you have to say the liver is normal, new line, the spleen is normal. So it's a little getting used to that if you want to do that. Now, with rScriptor, you don't say anything normal, so you just skip all that. But the point being is that you can't just dictate any way you want. There has to be a little thought into the way that you're going to divide up your dictation to make it fit into a structured report. And that has been the most challenge for a lot of radiologists, not really learning rScriptor, is just transitioning from dictating without any thought to the way it's going to fit into the report to now having to think about that. So that was some learning curve for some of them. And it's been true for almost every practice where, about 50% of the practice will adopt rScriptor, no problem. And then you'll have about 25% who are just too busy. They don't have time. You got to kind of push them along a little bit, but they'll do it. And then the last 25%, you got to really kind of pull them along. But what we found is even in that group, they're usually happy when they learn how to do this because they do see the benefit of dictating this way and the efficiency of it and the fact that they're less fatigued when they get done working. But it does take a little bit of prodding to get that last group through.
To touch on though what you had just said about like radiologist fatigue, we were talking briefly before we were recording about the radiologist shortage of what's going on in the current field, as well as shortage of rad techs. So I'm sure with not as many radiologists reading, and I feel like the abundance of patients that are coming to have studies done in the ER or outpatient studies, that, like you said, radiologists get fatigued with the amount of work that's present and how much energy has to go into it. So a tool like this is life-changing, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's another thing that you can do to help the practice. Again, it's trying to solve 2 problems. One is being more efficient. Can we do more work with the same people? But at the same time, it's not more work at the expense of your radiologist. I mean, most radiologists might dictate 20% more kind of on average than they dictated before. If you're doing 20% more work, you should be 20% more tired at the end of your shift than you were before. But the reality is they feel less tired. They feel less fatigued because the workflow has been streamlined. It's been corrected for this inefficient way that the dictation companies have built their software. rScriptor fixes a lot of those problems. And that's kind of what you want is to, whether it's rScriptor or any other software, you need to fix the workflow problems that are creating the issue for your practice. We have one of those solutions, and I'm sure there's other companies that are working on the same thing, just trying to make your life easier as a radiologist. One of the frustrations is that, we have a proven product that it's going to make your life better, but you have a hard time getting a radiologist to even try it, because I've done it this way and I like it this way. And we're saying if you would just try this thing and learn how to use it, I can almost guarantee you're going to be happy about it. And you just get a lot who won't even try it. What we found is if you leave it up to the radiologists, and this has been it could almost be a rule. It's so common now. You'll get about half the radiologists to use rScriptor because half will say, yeah, this makes sense. I get it. They start using it. They go, this works. I love it. I'm going to keep doing it. And then you'll get about half who won't try it and will never give it a try. Now, that's if you leave it up to the radiologist. If you have administration, or especially if you have kind of what we call champions, most software companies will call it champion, meaning somebody who says, I'm going to be the first and I'm going to teach you all why it's better. If you have champions or you have administration pushing it, you'll get that other group in there. And the funny thing is, if you get that other group in there, that group will be just as happy as the first group. We've seen that over and over again. We've gotten emails where the first practice we did it where they forced, they were basically, we want everybody using it. We had people say, I will never use this blankety blank software, no matter what you say. And they eventually did use it. And then I got emails from some of those same people said, okay, I just want to apologize. I didn't get what you were talking about. This really is better than what I was doing before. And so even with those hardcore people who say, I'll never try it, don't try to force it on me, with practices, teleradiology practices in particular, who said, no, we really believe in this software and we believe we're getting better reports and our customers are happier. With those practices, pushing them along and getting them to try it, they're usually happy they did eventually adopt it. It's funny, sometimes they have problems with the software. They're like, something's not quite right with the way that they work. And you just never hear from them. And then I hear from them, 2 months later after they're still having the same problem. I'm like, I could have fixed this in 5 minutes if you told me 2 months ago. You just communicate, but it's just hard. They just don't communicate with you very well.
So everybody, this is John Stewart with me tonight talking about the amazing software that he has developed, rScriptor, from the Scriptor software company. Hopefully the radiologists that are out there who are listening, if you're not already using it, possibly have your practice check it out. John, thanks again for taking the time to be with me tonight.
Yeah, I greatly appreciate you having me on. It's been great.
All right, everybody, my name's Jen. This is John. And for the Skeleton Crew, if you haven't seen the previous episodes or listened to them, go and check them out on Apple Podcasts, YouTube. We're also too on Spotify. So, all right, we'll see you guys next week.
You've been watching The Skeleton Crew, brought to you by xraytech.org. On the next episode, join us to explore the present and the future of the rad tech career in the field of radiology.